The letter arrived on a Tuesday. She read it twice. The second time, her hands were steady. That was the part that frightened her. Outside, 3/4 of a mile of fence line stood unfinished, 2 years unfinished, running along the northern boundary of land that was not yet legally hers to lose. Tomorrow morning, a government examiner would ride up that lane. By noon, everything she had left of the life she and Raymond had built together would either still be hers, or it wouldn't. She folded the letter, put it in her apron pocket. Somewhere south of the county road, a man named Denton Pruitt was waiting for Thursday. She went to check the barn latch, came back, stood in the dark dooryard, and looked at the fence line she couldn't see. Then, before dawn, wheels on the lane. Horses, a wagon she hadn't sent for, and a man who took his hat off before he said a word. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, and Corinne Hale read it twice at the kitchen table by lamplight, though she had the gist of it by the end of the first line. She read it a second time anyway, because sometimes a document that will take everything from you deserves the courtesy of being read twice. The land office at Alturas regretted to inform her. That was how it began. Regretted. As though some clerk in a wool coat had lost sleep over it. As though the word regret, typed cleanly on government paper, made what followed any less a blow to the chest. Pursuant to a contest filed against her final proof, an examiner would call at the homestead on Thursday morning to inspect improvements as required under the Homestead Act. Failure to demonstrate cultivation, a habitable dwelling, and enclosure of the claimed acreage would result in the claim being declared abandoned and open to the contesting party. The contesting party was a man named Denton Pruitt. Corinne set the letter down on the table. Then she picked it up again. Then she set it down. The lamp guttered once in a draft from the window she hadn't properly sealed before winter. The one Raymond had meant to get to and hadn't. The one she'd meant to get to after Raymond and hadn't either. 2 years of not getting to things. 2 years of meaning to and finding each morning that meaning to was not the same as doing, and doing was not the same as done. She was 38 years old. She had come to Juniper Bench as a bride of 22. Following Raymond Hale on the promise of good grass and better water, and she'd buried him on land that was not yet legally theirs to lose. 5 years of proving up requirements standing between a homestead filing and a deed. Raymond dead a full 2 years shy of the finish line. She had kept the place going since milking, plowing, fencing, mending, telling herself each season that the next would be easier. Finding each one harder instead. The north fence line was the problem. 3/4 of a mile of it still bare, running along the boundary where Raymond had meant to string wire before the fever took him quiet in his sleep one February night. 2 years of grief-driven effort, and she had not closed that gap alone. The roof of the storage catch still wanted its final course of shakes, the sort of job that needed a second body on the ladder and another pair of hands below. And the northeast corner of the cultivated ground, the corner an examiner would walk to, first because it was plainly visible from the county road, had gone to cheat grass. The summer she couldn't keep pace with both the plow and the milk cow. She had exactly 1 day left to finish what 4 days of hard labor would barely answer. She folded the letter along its existing creases and put it in the pocket of her work apron, where it sat against her hip for the remainder of the evening like a stone she couldn't set down. She washed the supper dish. She checked the latch on the barn. She stood in the dooryard in the October dark and looked at the north fence line she couldn't see and thought about Denton Pruitt, who had filed contest papers against her claim without ever once, in her recollection, setting foot on the land he was contesting. 3 weeks earlier she had posted a notice in the Modoc County paper. One hand wanted. Steady work, $30 a month, and board, Hale Place, Juniper Bench. She had pictured, if she pictured anything, a single man riding in with a bedroll and a willingness to work through a winter. Someone who understood fence and shakes and a plow that pulled left when the ground was wet. She had not pictured what came up the lane the following Wednesday at first light. The wagon came out of the gray before the sun properly cleared the Warner Range, a spring wagon loaded to its bows with tools and gear, drawn by 2 mismatched horses, a big roan and a shorter bay that walked in different rhythms and somehow covered ground anyway.
Corinne heard it before she saw it.
She was at the well with a bucket, still in the early stages of a day, that felt like it would require more of her than she currently had to give. She straightened and turned and watched the wagon come the last 100 yards of lane at a walk, the driver giving the horses their heads on the uneven ground. The man who climbed down from the seat was not what she expected. She wasn't certain what she had expected, but it wasn't this. He was large in the way that made you recalibrate your sense of a space. Not large like a man who had grown wide and slow with years, but large the way certain landforms were large, as though the ground had simply produced him thicker and deeper than the usual run of things. He stood beside the wagon wheel, and he was taller than the wheel's top spoke by a clear margin. His shoulders filled the space between the wagon and the open air, with the matter-of-fact thoroughness of a barn door. The hands that unhooked the trace chain were the hands of a man who had used a sledgehammer for enough seasons that the muscle had reshaped the bone around it. He wore canvas work pants dark at the knees with ground-in soil that no washing would fully lift, suspenders of flat brown leather over a flannel shirt the color of old slate, and boots laced high and worn at the heel in the particular way of boots that had been good boots once and still were, just differently. His hat was a broad-brimmed felt the color of a storm cloud, and he wore it the way working men wore a good hat, tilted neither for vanity nor for shade, but simply positioned for a day's labor. He took it off before he said a single word. Corinne noticed that. The hat came off before the introduction, before the handshake, before any assessment of whether the situation warranted the courtesy. It just came off. As though removing it in front of a woman was not a calculation but a fact, built into him at a level below thought. She hadn't seen anyone do that since the day they buried Raymond. Silas Ward. His voice was level, not quiet and not loud. The voice of a man who didn't need volume to be heard. "I've come about the hand wanted notice." Corinne looked past him at the wagon. Then she looked at the two young men who had stepped down from the wagon bed, while Silas Ward was still introducing himself. The taller one, broad through the shoulders, maybe 19, with his father's build and a younger man's quickness in the eyes, had already taken an axe handle from the wagon, without anyone telling him to. The other was 18 or thereabouts, lean in a different way, the kind of lean that came from covering ground rather than lifting weight, and he was looking at the fence line with the practiced assessment of someone who already knew what needed doing. "Mr. Ward." She kept her voice measured. The notice was for one hand, it was. He didn't look apologetic. He looked like a man stating a plain fact, plainly. "I'm the one hand. These are mine, Ellis and Grant. They eat whether they're standing here or somewhere else, and I can't make them eat less by standing them idle. Man who hires me gets 2 more for the asking and pays for none of it besides supper." He turned his head and looked at the north fence line, then the catch roof, then the northeast corner where the cheat grass had caught the early light and showed itself for exactly what it was. When he looked back at her, there was nothing in his expression that could be called pity. But there was a recognition. The recognition of someone who had looked at the arithmetic of a hard situation and knew what the numbers said without needing to say them aloud. "Ma'am, if you'll forgive my saying so, it looks like you've got a day's worth of trouble and about 1 day left to answer it." She came close to saying something she would have regretted, not because he was wrong, because he was right in the particular way that made a thing harder to hear, not easier. 2 years of keeping the assessment inside her own chest, and then a stranger arrived at dawn and said it in one sentence before he'd even checked the condition of her harness. She did not cry. She had not cried in front of a stranger since the morning they lowered Raymond into the ground, and she was not going to begin now. Standing in her own dooryard, with an examiner's letter folded in her apron pocket, and 2 young men already making quiet decisions about the tool situation near the wagon. "I can't pay 3 wages," she said. "Didn't ask for 3. Silas Ward put his hat back on, asked for 1. "The other 2 are mine to account for." She looked at him for a long moment. He did not look away, and he did not look impatient. He simply stood there in his old good boots on the lane of her homestead and waited for her to think it through, which struck her as either very confident or very respectful, and she couldn't yet determine which. "The fence first," she said. 3/4 of a mile north line corner posts are set, but the wire's never been strung. Coils in the barn. "Show us." She showed them. By 7 in the morning the lane looked different. By 7 in the morning there were 3 men, moving along the north property line, with a purposefulness that Corinne had not seen in her dooryard since Raymond was alive, and something in her chest that had been running on a very thin ration of hope for 2Gs began, cautiously, to consider the possibility of more. Silas Ward worked the post-hole auger the way some men worked a pen with an easy authority, like the instrument had no will of its own to resist him. He drove holes at intervals that didn't need measuring, because he had measured enough fence lines in his life that his feet knew the spacing. He didn't hurry and he didn't slow. He worked at the pace a machine would work if a machine had the good sense not to waste motion. Behind him, Grant followed the strung wire with a quiet efficiency that matched his brother's rhythm. Without copying it where Ellis was methodical, Grant was fluid, moving around obstacles and adjusting to ground variations with the ease of someone whose body had made a long peace with physical work. And Silas Ward did what a man does when he's the most capable person in a situation and doesn't need to prove it. He moved between the two of them, checking angles, driving the occasional corner post that required the full weight of a man his size behind the mallet, and reading the fence line ahead of them the way a river pilot reads water for what it was about to do, not what it was doing now. When the grade dropped toward the gully at the 3/4 point, he redirected without being asked, pulling the line tighter on the downhill side before the wire had a chance to sag. He didn't explain the adjustment to anyone. He simply made it and moved on. Corinne watched them for 7 minutes. Then she went to the catch and got a bundle of shakes and a hammer and climbed the ladder to the roof. This was the thing about grief that people who hadn't carried it a long time didn't fully understand. It didn't make you unable to work. It made you work differently, heavier and with less certainty. She had shingled roofs before. She and Raymond had done the main house together, the summer after they filed, with a neighbor's horse and a borrowed ladder and considerably more confidence than skill. She knew the order of it. Overlap the previous course by a third. Keep the lines straight. Don't let a gap open at the ridge, or everything below it becomes someone else's problem eventually. What she didn't have was someone at the base of the ladder handing shakes up. So she carried them herself, an armful at a time, and set them in a stack near her knees, and worked from the stack, slower than it should have been. But she was moving and the ridge was getting closer, and each course she laid was one fewer course between now and Thursday morning. She was on her 3rd trip up the ladder when she registered that Silas Ward had stopped walking the fence line and was standing at the base of the catch, looking up at her. She kept working. There's more wire to string. Ellis has it. He looked at the roof, not at her. The look of a man calculating a problem, not admiring the view. You're handing yourself shakes from your own stack, I noticed. A beat. Then Grant. I've got it. That was Grant's voice from somewhere she couldn't see, already moving. And then Grant was at the base of the ladder, and the next time she reached for a shake, it was in her hand before she touched the stack, passed up with the wordless efficiency of someone who had supplied someone else on a roof before and knew the rhythm of it. She didn't ask when he'd shingled his first roof. She didn't ask how many since. She just laid shakes and Grant supplied them, and the ridge came closer at a pace that felt, for the first time in months, like it might actually arrive before Thursday. Silas went back to the fence line. She thought about that the way he had simply solved the problem and walked away from the solving of it. No ceremony, no commentary, no waiting to be thanked. She had met men who would have made an occasion of that kind of help, who would have stood at the base of the ladder and explained what they were doing and why it was a good idea, and perhaps inquired whether she found it useful. Silas Ward had organized the solution in about 12 seconds and redirected his attention to the next problem on the list. Raymond had been that kind of man. Not often, but in the moments that counted. She laid 2 more courses and didn't let herself think about that any further, because the ridge was close and she needed to count. By 10 o'clock the fence line was 2/3 strung, and the catch roof was 3/4 closed, and the northeast corner was getting its first pass with Silas Ward's plow, which was not her plow, but one he'd apparently loaded onto the wagon, because the notice hadn't said anything about plowing equipment, and he'd apparently assumed she'd need it, which she did. Her own plow had been pulling left for 8 months, and she had compensated by angling right on every pass, and the rows showed it. His rows were straight. She was down from the roof by 10:30, and working the northeast corner from the eastern edge, while Silas worked from the western side. Between them the cheatgrass was being turned under in long dark stripes. She had her own plow, the one that pulled left, because his was already in the ground, and she wasn't going to ask him to stop and trade. She compensated. She always compensated. The rows weren't as straight as his, but they were going in the right direction, and the cheatgrass was going down, and that was what Thursday required. He didn't say anything about the rows pulling left. She appreciated that specifically. Around 11, Ellis came from the fence line and picked up one of the hoes from the barn wall and began working the turned rows ahead of the plow, clearing root clumps that the blade had folded over instead of cutting clean. He worked without instruction. He simply saw what the next useful thing was and did it. Grant came down from the catch around the same time and took up a second hoe, and they worked the rows together in a line that moved steadily west to east. Two young men who had apparently been doing this sort of parallel labor long enough that they didn't need to coordinate it out loud. The fence was strung by 11:15. All of it, corner to corner, taut and even, the wire catching the late October light along the north line in a way that made the line look intentional, which it was. But there's a difference between intended and done. And for 2 years this line had been intended, and now it was done. Corinne stood at the barn door and looked at it for a moment she couldn't really afford and took it anyway. The catch roof was closed by noon. The northeast corner was turned and rowed by 1:30, and when Silas Ward unhitched the plow horse and walked the fence line one final time, checking tension at each post with his hand rather than his eye, Corinne understood she was watching someone who didn't consider a job finished until it had been checked. Not mistrusted. Checked. The way you check a door you've already locked because the locking of it matters enough to verify. Raymond had done that too. Walked the finished fence to feel it rather than see it. She went inside and began lunch. She laid out everything she had that was worth laying out: a pot of beans that had been on since the previous night, cornbread from the pan, and the cured ham she had been saving for an occasion she hadn't been able to define. She couldn't define this one either exactly. It wasn't celebration. It wasn't gratitude, though it was that, too. It was something closer to the feeling of seeing the arithmetic finally balance after a long time of knowing it was off. She set 4 places at the table, thought about it, moved the setup outside to the long board under the cottonwood, because the day was cool but dry, and the table inside wouldn't comfortably seat all of them without someone's elbow in someone else's business. Silas Ward sat with his hat on his knee and his back straight, and ate like a man who had learned somewhere that a working man's table was not a man's own table, regardless of how welcome he was at it. Ellis and Grant ate with the focused application of very hungry young men being polite about it. Nobody spoke much. This was the kind of silence that came after a morning of considerable work, and not much talk. Silence with a shape to it, companionable and tired in a way that didn't require filling. It was Grant who broke it, though not with words. He stood up from the board without any announcement, turned south toward the county road, and stood still for a moment with his head tipped. Silas Ward was on his feet before Grant turned around. "Smoke," Grant said. South of the road, past the section corner. Corinne was already looking. There it was, a thin column first, then wider as she watched, rising from the direction of the Pruitt claim on the far side of the county road. October grass. No rain in 3 weeks. A wind that had been steady from the northwest since morning. That's dry range and a northwest wind behind it. Silas said it not as alarm, but as assessment. The assessment of a man rapidly calculating what dry range and a northwest wind together meant for everything between that column of smoke and the next water source. Whoever's claim that sits on, it won't still be theirs by supper if somebody doesn't put it back. Corinne told him whose claim it was. He looked at her for a moment. Something moved behind his eyes, that same thing she had seen when she first said the name Denton Pruitt, that older and heavier thing that wasn't surprise. It moved and then it stilled, and when he spoke again, his voice was exactly as level as it had been at every other point in the morning. "Doesn't change it," he said. "Fire doesn't negotiate property lines." No, she was already heading for the house. "Give me 30 seconds. She was back in 28 with 4 burlap sacks she'd wetted at the kitchen bucket and a wool blanket she'd grabbed off the bedroom chair. Not enough. Enough to start. They went. The smoke was bigger by the time they reached the section corner, spreading along the ground before it rose, which was the sign of a fire that had found its footing in the root grass and was moving rather than merely burning. Corinne had seen grass fires before one, in the 3rd year of their claim, that had taken the corner of Raymond's original fence and stopped 30 yards from the barn. This one had more room to run. The Pruitt claim sat on the south side of the county road, 160 acres that showed the evidence of a man who visited his improvements rather than lived them. The cabin was a single-room structure with one window and a door that didn't sit plumb in its frame. There was a small patch of turned ground near the south end, mostly gone to thistle. And there was a hayrick, a full one, which struck Corinne as odd given there was no stock on the claim, and no indication there had been staked near the property's center in dry grass that had not been grazed or managed in longer than one season. If that hayrick caught, the fire would have fuel enough to jump the county road. And the county road was 50 yards from the north fence line they had spent the morning building. Silas Ward had arrived at that same calculation approximately 4 seconds before she did, because he was already moving toward the hayrick with the direct line of a man who had prioritized correctly and wasn't wasting time on alternatives. Ellis took the east flank, beating the ground fire back from the fence line of the Pruitt claim before it could breach into open range. Grant worked the west edge with the wet sacks, moving at a run, tamping out fingers of fire that kept trying to reach the dry grass beyond the turned edge. Corinne went at the hayrick side. She beat at the ring of burning grass around the rick's base with the wool blanket, which was too heavy and too hot to hold for long, but was the only thing she had with enough surface to matter. The smoke was worse close to the ground. She kept low and kept moving and kept beating, and tried not to breathe in the long pulls that her body wanted. Silas Ward was on the other side of the rick doing the same thing with 2 of the burlap sacks, and his reach covered ground that hers couldn't, not because she wasn't working but because his arms, when extended, put the strike point significantly farther from his body than hers did from her own, which meant each swing covered more arc. She watched this for a moment in the middle of the fire and thought, that is what it looks like when a body that big works at capacity. It doesn't look like effort. It looks like weather the rick held. They worked the fire back to the edge of the turned ground and then past it into the black, where there was nothing left to burn. Ellis called from the eastern edge that his line was cold. Grant called from the west that his was holding. Silas walked the perimeter of the hayrick 1 circuit, checking for heat in the grass, the way he had walked the fence line, checking tension. Not mistrusting. Checking. Corinne stood in the black zone with the scorched blanket in her hands and breathed. Ellis had a blister forming on the back of his right hand where a burning fragment had caught him. He said nothing about it. Grant had lost his hat somewhere in the run from the west edge and hadn't gone back for it. Silas had a long scorch mark along the left forearm of his flannel shirt, where he had apparently pressed his arm against the rick itself at some point, though he hadn't mentioned it during or after. They stood in the wind and the smoke and nobody said anything for a moment. Then the sound of hoofbeats on the county road. Denton Pruitt came off the road at a trot and pulled up at the edge of the burned ground, and he looked at what remained of his claim's south section, the black grass, the standing hayrick, the 4 people who had no particular obligation to be standing there. And his horse moved under him, and he held it still with his knees and didn't say anything. He was a man in his mid-50s, running to softness at the jaw and at the middle, dressed in town clothes that had seen too much riding to look like town clothes anymore, wool trousers, a frock coat that had been dark gray once and was something less definite now, a hat that was cleaner than a working man's hat, and not clean enough to belong to a gentleman. He had the look of a man who existed in the space between 2 worlds and had made a career of that positioning. He looked at Corinne first, then at Ellis, then at Grant, and then his eyes moved to Silas Ward and stayed there, and something happened in his face that Corinne couldn't fully read at the distance, but that felt significant in a way she filed away to think about later. You fought it. He said it without inflection. He said it the way a man says a thing he is trying to believe while he is still saying it. Fire doesn't read land office filings, Mr. Pruitt. She was tired enough that the anger she might otherwise have reached for wasn't available. What she had instead was something quieter, and in its own way harder. Turns out we don't either. He looked at her for a long moment, then at Silas Ward again. He did not speak to Silas Ward. He did not speak to any of them further. He turned his horse and went back up to the county road, and the sound of the hoofed beats moved north and then thinned into the afternoon wind and was gone. Corinne looked at the standing hayrick, at the black ground around it, at the county road that was 50 yards from the fence line they had built that morning, still standing because they had gotten here in time. She looked at Silas Ward. He was looking at where Pruitt had been, not at where Pruitt was going. The expression on his face was the most complicated thing she had seen on it all day. Not anger, not satisfaction. Something she didn't have a ready name for the look of a man who has just seen something he knew theoretically brought into physical proximity for the first time. Something that requires recalibration of the distance between knowing and seeing. He turned away from it and looked at the hayrick and then at his two sons. Grant. A single word. Grant. Lost my hat. Said flat. Not as complaint, just as fact. We'll find it on the way back. They walked the county road north and Corinne walked beside Silas Ward, and the late October sun came down at an angle that put long shadows ahead of all of them, leading the way back to the lane and the cottonwood and the remains of a lunch that had been interrupted by a fire on an enemy's claim. When you heard his name this morning, she said. She didn't finish the sentence. She left it open and let him choose what to do with it. He walked several steps without answering. His boots on the road made a sound that she had already somehow categorized in her internal library of sounds as one she would recognize in future without needing to see its source. She noticed herself noticing that and decided not to examine it. There are names you remember, he said finally, not because the person is famous or important in any public way, but because something happened that put the name in a part of your memory where it doesn't weather the way other things weather. A pause. I didn't know it was him for certain until you said it a second time. And then I did and I came here to fix a fence. He said it without apparent irony. That's what I'm still doing. They came back up the lane to the Hale place, with the afternoon light falling gold on the newly shingled ketch roof and the strung fence line running north, exactly as far as it was supposed to run, and the turned ground in the northeast corner showing dark furrows in the long raking light of October. 3/4 of a mile of fence, a closed roof, a cultivated corner, done. The examiner was coming Thursday morning. Tomorrow. Corinne stood in the dooryard in the same place she had stood in the October dark the night before, looking at things she couldn't see, and found that now she could see them. The fence was real. The roof was real. The furrows were real. The arithmetic that had refused to balance for 2 years had been addressed in a single working day by a man she had not met until this morning, his 2 grown sons, and her own 2 hands. She did not feel relieved. Not exactly. Relief implies that the threat is gone, and the threat was not gone. Pruitt's contest was still on file. The examiner was still coming. And whatever Silas Ward knew about Denton Pruitt, and whatever Denton Pruitt knew about Silas Ward was a piece of the story she did not yet have. But she felt something adjacent to relief. Something that had the shape of steadiness after a long time of standing in wind. Ellis and Grant were at the wagon, checking the horses. Silas Ward was standing at the edge of the turned ground, looking at the corner, in the same way he had looked at the fence line, taking inventory of what was done, cataloging what remained. Corinne walked to where he stood. They stood together looking at the furrows for a moment. Then she said, "His name is on the Tully Flat relinquishment." Silas Ward went very still, not startled, stilled. The difference was considerable. Startled was the body reacting to news. Stilled was the body holding everything in place, while the mind moved around something it already knew the shape of, but hadn't fully named. "The claim you filed on," she said. 3.5 years proving up. The improvements that the land office said were insufficient. Yes, Denton Pruitt. He was quiet for long enough that the wind moved across the turned ground between them and the cottonwood at the lane's edge, shifted its remaining leaves. October leaves on a cottonwood butter, yellow and small against the gray-blue sky. "I knew someone had moved against that filing," he said. "I never knew who held the paper." A pause. "I've been angry at a gap in the record for 4 years. That's a particular kind of anger, nowhere to put it. Now you know where. Now I know where." He looked at the corner. Not at her. "It doesn't change tonight. There's still an examiner coming tomorrow morning. It changes something. He considered that. Yes, he allowed. It changes something. They walked back to the wagon in the last of the afternoon light, and the Hale place looked different in that light than it had looked. In the gray of the morning, looked like a place that intended to remain a place, with a fence along its north line and a closed roof on its catch, and a corner that was going to show cultivation and not cheat grass. When a government examiner walked out from the county road and looked, Corinne fed them supper and did not make a ceremony of it, because they were all too tired for ceremony, and the occasion called for food and warmth and a fire in the grate, not for speeches. They ate at the table inside because the evening had turned cold with the sun gone, and afterward Ellis and Grant took their bedrolls to the wagon and arranged themselves with the ease of men who had slept outdoors in every variety of weather that this part of California could produce. Silas Ward remained at the table a moment after the young men had gone out. "The examiner," he said. "I'll be here. If you want an account of what we did today and in what order. He's a government man. He'll want to see it, not hear about it. He'll want to see it and hear about it. In my experience, they write down what they're told as much as what they observe." He turned his hat in his hands. "I can speak to the fence and the roof. The corner is yours to speak to. You plowed it alongside me, and you know the ground better than I do." She looked at him for a moment. This man who had arrived at dawn with 2 sons and a loaded wagon, and had worked the better part of a day on her land for a wage she hadn't yet confirmed, and had driven away a fire on the land of the man who was trying to take what she had, and had done all of it with the same steady, unremarkable purposefulness with which another man might do the ordinary work of his own ordinary morning. "What do you want from this?" she asked. Not hostile. Genuinely asking, he met her eyes. His were the particular gray of overcast October sky, the color that looks like the absence of color until you look at it long enough to see all the tones in it. $30, he said, "and a night's sleep before we find out how the examiner writes his notes." She almost smiled. "Done." He put his hat on and said good night and went out to the wagon, and Corinne Hale sat at her kitchen table for a while longer in the lamplight, the examiner's letter still in her apron pocket, and thought about fences. About the specific and concrete fact of this one, 3/4 of a mile strung in a morning by a man who owed her nothing beyond a day's wage, and who had done it with the kind of thoroughness that suggested he was not thinking about the wage at all while he did it. She thought about Denton Pruitt's face when he looked at Silas Ward. She thought about what Silas Ward had said about names that don't weather. She turned the lamp down and went to bed in the house that was not yet legally hers, on land that would either still be hers or not by Thursday noon, and she slept better than she had slept in 8 months. She would not understand why, quite until much later, but she slept. And outside in the October dark, the fence stood along the north line, running straight and taut from corner to corner, exactly as far as it was supposed to run. Thursday morning came the way hard mornings do in October, fast and cold, the light arriving before the warmth had any intention of following. Corinne was at the fence before sunrise, not checking it, not precisely. She knew it was there. She had watched it go up post by post and wire by wire, and she knew it was there the way you know a fact that you have verified with your own hands. But she walked it anyway, in her calico work dress, and her heavy boots, and the wool shawl she'd pulled off the hook by the door, walking the north line in the gray pre-dawn while the frost held on the grass, and her breath came in small visible bursts, and the wire caught no light yet because there was no light to catch. 3/4 of a mile, corner to corner done. She turned at the far post and walked back, and Silas Ward was standing at the barn end of the line when she returned, hat already on, flannel shirt already tucked, suspenders straight. He had a mug of coffee in each hand, and he held one out when she came within arm's reach, and she took it without making anything of the gesture, which was the correct response to a gesture that hadn't made anything of itself. "He'll come from the road," Silas said. Not to her specifically. The way a man talks through a problem out loud when someone capable is standing close enough to hear. "Northeast corner first. It's what you'd check first from the road." She wrapped both hands around the mug. The coffee was stronger than she made it herself. She noted this and said nothing about it. Then the dwelling. Then he'll want to walk the fence line from the barn end to confirm the enclosure. The corner rows are straight enough for a government man. She almost said they weren't as straight as his. She didn't, because they were straight enough, and that was what Thursday required. And pointing out the difference between sufficient and excellent served no one at this particular hour. The roof, closed and nailed. His voice carried the flat confidence of a man who had checked something twice with his hands and was therefore finished being uncertain about it. Grant went up at first light to look at the ridge in the cold. No gaps. She looked at him sidelong. He was looking at the fence line still, reading it the way he seemed to read everything, not admiring, not celebrating, just confirming. The steam from his mug rose and bent in the morning wind and disappeared. You sent your boy up a roof before sunrise to check work that was already done. I sent my son up a roof at first light to check work that was done in a hurry under time pressure by two people who are very good but not infallible. A pause. The kind of pause that was not uncertainty but precision. There's a difference. Corinne drank her coffee and thought that there was. That the difference between those two framings was in fact quite large, and that she had been thinking about it the wrong way. The examiner arrived at 8 in the morning, on a government-issue bay horse, with a leather satchel across the pommel, and the expression of a man who had ridden out from Altaris to check homestead improvements enough times to have formed strong opinions about what he was going to find before he found it. He was perhaps 50, narrow in the shoulders, with a kind of careful mustache that suggested he thought of his appearance as part of his professional presentation. He wore a wool coat over a vest and a hat that had been brushed that morning. He carried a pencil. He introduced himself with his title and his office, and gave his name as a formality. Corinne gave hers. He didn't ask about anyone else. Ellis and Grant had gone to the wagon with practiced invisibility, the kind of invisibility that comes from understanding when your presence complicates a situation unnecessarily. Silas Ward stood at the barn door and said nothing, and was not introduced, and the examiner looked at him once, with the look of a man cataloguing information he would decide how to file later. The examiner walked the north corner first, because it was visible from the road, because it was always the northeast corner. Corinne walked with him and described the cultivation schedule and the ground preparation and the varieties planted, and she described it in the specific and unhurried language of a woman who had worked the ground herself and knew it. The way you know something that has cost you something, he wrote. He crouched at the edge of a furrow and touched the turned soil with 2 fingers and wrote something else. He stood and looked toward the road, and then back at the corner and wrote again. He didn't smile, he didn't frown, he wrote. Then the dwelling. He walked the perimeter of the house, noted the foundation and the chimney and the window glass, real glass, which Raymond had insisted on in the first year, because Corinne had asked for it once, and he had heard once as the correct number of times to be asked. The examiner measured the interior in long steps and noted the ceiling height and opened the cellar door and looked down into it without going down, he wrote. He moved to the catch and looked at the roof, and Corinne watched him look at it and knew from the angle of his head that he was looking at the ridgeline specifically, checking for gaps or sag, and the ridgeline gave him nothing to write. That was a problem. Then the fence. He walked it from the barn end, which was what she had predicted, and she walked beside him and didn't talk because there was nothing she needed to say about this particular piece of work. It spoke for itself. It had been done by someone who knew how fence was supposed to be, and had made it that way, and a government examiner with a pencil and a satchel was not going to find a fault in it because there was no fault in it to find. At the 3/4 point where the grade dropped toward the gully, the examiner stopped and put his hand on the wire the way Silas had put his hand on it the day before. Testing tension. He moved his hand 6 inches along the wire and tested again. He looked at the post nearest the grade change, which was set deeper than the others, which was correct because a grade change post carries more load and needs more depth, which Silas Ward had understood without discussion and addressed without ceremony. The examiner wrote something that took longer to write than the other notes had taken. Corinne stood in the October morning with the frost finally off the grass and the sun coming over the Warner Range at a low angle that put a shine on the wire she hadn't noticed before, and waited. He finished writing. He put the pencil away. He looked at the fence line north to south one more time with the expression of a man finishing a calculation. Then he tipped his hat. "Ma'am." The single word carrying the weight of his professional conclusion, which was that everything he had been sent to verify had been verified, and there was nothing further he need faded from this particular property on this particular Thursday. He rode back to the county road and turned south toward Alturas, and Corinne watched him go until the bay horse and the leather satchel were small against the sage and then gone. She stood in the frost-cleared grass by the north fence line and put both hands flat against the top wire and felt the tension in it, cold through her palms. Solid. The kind of solid that meant it had been done correctly by someone who had not been required to do it correctly for her. She did not cry. She had made a promise to herself about crying in front of strangers, and she was going to honor that promise until she determined whether or not Silas Ward was still a stranger, which was a determination she was not prepared to make yet. But her throat did something, and she stood there with her hands on the wire until it stopped. The month that followed the examiner's visit did a thing that October months in Modoc County do when they decide to be honest about the season. It turned cold fast and stayed cold. The mornings coming in below freezing by the middle of the month, and the afternoons giving you 4 hours of usable warmth, if you were willing to work in a coat. The grass cured brown. The Warner Range went gray-white above the timberline. The cottonwood at the lane's end dropped its remaining leaves in 2 windy days and stood bare and silver-barked against the sky. Silas Ward stayed. He did not present this as a decision. He simply remained at the Hale place, past the day of the examiner's visit, and into the days that followed, working his $30 wage with the same level and unhurried application he had brought to the first morning. And the work found him, because a homestead in October always has more to do than it has done. He rehung the barn door that had been dropping on the left hinge since spring. He remortared the chimney base where a winter crack had been letting cold air into the kitchen wall. He split cord wood with Ellis in a rhythm that produced more wood in an afternoon than Corinne had been able to produce in a week alone, and he stacked it with the density of someone who had spent enough winters knowing what it meant to run short. Ellis and Grant worked alongside him with the self-direction of young men who had learned their trade from a father, who believed that knowing what to do next was part of the job, not a separate skill. Corinne worked beside all of them and did not feel supplemented. She felt accompanied, which was a different thing entirely. She had been supplemented before by neighbors in the first spring after Raymond, who came with food and offers of help that had the texture of managing her, rather than working with her. This was not that. Silas Ward did not manage. He showed up and looked at what the land needed and applied himself to it, and he made enough room in that application for her to apply herself beside him without anyone ever having to have a conversation about it. 2 weeks passed. The letter came from the Alturas land office on a Wednesday. She read it at the kitchen table, same lamplight, because the days were short enough now that the lamp was necessary in the morning. The contest against her homestead claim filed by Denton Pruitt had been withdrawn by the contesting party himself, by written notice received at the office on the preceding Friday. The claim was clear. The filing stood. She sat with the letter for a while. Then she got up and went out to where Silas Ward was working the stuck gate on the north pasture, and she held up the letter, and he read it from the distance of the gate hinges without moving toward her. And she saw him understand it in the set of his jaw and the small stillness that moved through him before he went back to the gate. She went back inside and put the letter in the box on the shelf where she kept the important documents next to the original homestead filing and Raymond's deed of equipment from the first year and the receipt for the window glass. Then she stood in the kitchen and felt the particular silence of a thing that has been threatening for a long time finally stepping back. Not gone. Not resolved. The land was hers on paper, but Denton Pruitt was still in Modoc County, and Silas Ward's Tousley Flat relinquishment was still in someone's possession, and the story between those two men was still a story she only had one side of. But the immediate danger had retreated, and retreating danger, even unresolved danger, creates a different kind of silence than waiting danger does. She made lunch. She made enough for 4. That evening, after Ellis and Grant had gone to the wagon with their bedrolls, Corinne found herself doing something she hadn't planned to do, and therefore found harder to stop. She was at the work table in the kitchen. going through the small account book where she kept the homestead expenses, when she realized Silas Ward was still at the table with his coffee, not reading, not doing anything in particular, simply present in the way that some people could be present in a space without requiring the space to acknowledge them. She looked up from the account book. He looked at her. Neither of them said anything for a moment. The fire in the grate said things. The wind outside said things. The silence between the two of them was the particular silence of two people who have been working alongside each other long enough to have dispensed with the social furniture that usually fills that kind of quiet. Ellis's hand, she said. The burn. It healed cleanly. Yes. A pause. You wrapped it well. He sat very still for it. He learned that from his mother. His voice didn't change when he said it, which told her more than a changed voice would have. She had a way with injuries not flinching, not rushing. Something steady in how she worked. He was 7 when she died, old enough to carry the impression of it. Corinne set the account book down. What was her name? Clara. Simple. Not offered as an invitation to further inquiry, but not closed either. The name of a woman who had been the center of a household and was now the center of a different kind of gravity, the kind that pulls from absence rather than presence. Raymond didn't like to be tended. She said it without intending to, and then, because she had said it, she continued. When he was sick in the last winter, he'd ask me to leave the room, and then call me back when he needed water. He thought he was protecting me from seeing him diminished. He didn't understand that I would have sat with him through anything, and the protection was the wrong thing to offer. Silas Ward looked at his coffee for a moment. Clara wanted me in the room. A long pause. For every hour of it. I was there for the last 2 days without sleeping, and I have wondered since many times whether being there was a gift I gave her, or a thing I needed for myself that I dressed up as a gift. The fire shifted. A log settling. Probably both, Corinne said. Probably. He looked up at her. That's the honest answer, and I appreciate that you gave it. She picked the account book back up and pretended for a moment to look at the numbers in it, though she was not reading the numbers. She was aware of the kitchen, the lamp's warmth, the sound of the fire, the presence of a man at her table who had told her something true and who had received something true in return, and who was now sitting in the aftermath of that exchange with the same steadiness he brought to every other thing. She was also aware that she was aware of all this, which was information she was not ready to do anything with. Tule flat, she said. Back on stable ground. Practical ground. You were 3.5 years into the proving up when the filing was contested. 3 years, 7 months. Precise. The precision of a number that hasn't been allowed to blur with time, because blurring would mean releasing it. I had the house built and a well dug, and I'd broken 20 acres. I had fence along 2 sides, a pause. I had Clara in the ground by then. But the boys were there and the ground was good, and I thought the claim was what I could give them in place of what I couldn't give them back. Corinne put the account book away entirely. She wasn't going to look at it again tonight, and pretending otherwise was a waste of lamplight. The man who refiled after you. Was it a cattleman? It went to a cattle company in the end. I found that much. The paper moved through someone else first, but I never learned who held the relinquishment. He looked at the window, which showed nothing but dark and their own reflection in the glass. It is a particular kind of anger, not knowing. You can't put it somewhere specific. It just occupies general space, and now it has an address. He looked back at her. The gray of his eyes in the lamplight was the gray of creek water over slate, not cold, just deep, and running over something solid. Now it has an address. She thought about asking what he intended to do with that address. She decided that the question was premature and possibly not hers to ask. What she knew was that he had been given the opportunity to do something violent and obvious with the information on the day they stood on Pruitt's burned land, and he had done nothing of the kind, and that restraint had not looked like weakness from where she was standing. It had looked like a man who had made a decision about what kind of person he was going to be, and was holding to it under conditions that made the holding difficult. She respected that, more than she had expected to. The end of October arrived, and with it the late golden afternoons that Modoc County produced sometimes before the real cold settled in 3 or 4 days of almost warmth, the sage going silver in the low light, the Warner Range turning colors above the timberline that would be gone by November. Corinne found herself on the second of those afternoons, standing at the kitchen window looking at the fence line and thinking about what came next. The land was hers. The claim stood. The examiner's notes would go to Alturas, and Denton Pruitt had withdrawn his contest, and in a matter of months the deed would be issued, and she would own this land in the way that law made ownership permanent. She had kept what Raymond had started. She had brought it across the finish line with less than a day to spare, and with help she had not been able to plan for, and should not have been able to count on. And now the man who had provided that help was in her barn rehanging the second door that had been dropping. And his 2 sons were somewhere on the property doing something useful that they had identified themselves without being asked, and the rhythm of the Hale place had altered since that Wednesday morning in a way that she had not chosen and could not honestly say she wanted to undo, which was a problem, or not a problem, or a thing that was going to require thinking about when the time was right, and the time was not right yet, because Denton Pruitt was still in Modoc County, and Silas Ward still had no land of his own. And whatever Pruitt had done to the Thule flat filing 9 years ago was still a fact sitting in the land office records, and a fact that lives in a records office has a way of eventually demanding to be addressed. She was on her second cup of coffee, and her 4th pass through this particular loop of thinking when Grant came to the kitchen door. He knocked. He always knocked, which she had noticed the first time and filed as evidence of something she was still assembling. Mrs. Hale. He was 17-18 now. She corrected herself. 18 and carrying it with the tentative authority of someone who had just arrived at an age that conferred new rights and wasn't entirely sure yet how to hold them. There's a horse at the county road. Been there a few minutes. Not moving. She looked past him through the door. A figure at the county road, a horse standing still facing the lane. The horse was a dark bay with a frock coat on the rider. Corinne set her coffee down. She went out. She did not get Silas. She walked the lane to the county road herself, in her calico dress and her heavy boots and the shawl she'd grabbed because the afternoon had gone cold while she wasn't paying attention, and she walked it at her own pace, which was not slow but was deliberate, because she was not going to walk fast toward Denton Pruitt as though he had summoned her. He had dismounted by the time she reached the road. He was standing with his hat in both hands. The hat in both hands gesture was not lost on her, given the particular association she now had with it. He was older looking than he had been 2 weeks before. Not older in the way of weeks older, in the way of something that had worked on him internally and left a mark on the outside. His frock coat was the same coat, the dark gray that was no longer quite gray, and his boots needed attention, and his jaw had the look of a man who had made a decision that had cost him sleep. She stopped 6 feet from him and waited. I withdrew the contest. He said it not as news since she had the letter, but as a way of opening the subject, as an acknowledgement that there was a subject to be opened. I received the letter. He looked at the lane behind her, then brought his eyes back to her face with the deliberateness of someone making themselves do a thing they'd rather not. I need to say something to you, and to the man who was here that day. The large man. Mr. Ward, yes. He turned the hat in his hands once. Is he on the property? She looked at him for a long moment, assessing. Not the threat level. She had already made a decision about threat level, based on the way he was holding his hat and the lines around his eyes, but the sincerity level, which was a harder assessment and required more evidence. Come up to the house, she said. She went back up the lane, without looking to see if he followed. She heard the horse's hooves on the lane behind her, and then the sound of him tying it at the post near the barn. When she came around to the front of the house, Silas Ward was standing at the barn door. He had heard the horse. He had heard it, or he had seen it, or Grant had said something, it didn't matter how. He was there. Ellis was a few steps behind him. Silas Ward looked at Denton Pruitt the way the land looked at weather. Not braced for it, not welcoming, simply receiving it, with the solidity of something that had been in place long enough to have a position. Pruitt came to a stop in the yard and looked at Silas Ward and didn't speak immediately. He was clearly assembling something. Something he had perhaps assembled before, in a different hour, and now had to reassemble in the actual presence of the person it was meant for, which was proving harder than the prior assembly. Mr. Ward. And then he stopped. Ellis took one step forward. One step. Not aggressive, but deliberate. The step of a young man who has positioned himself between his father and a potential something and isn't going to pretend he hasn't. Silas Ward put one hand out, level, without looking at Ellis. Stay. Ellis stayed. Pruitt looked at the ground. Then up. Then at Silas Ward directly, without the evasion of a man who has decided on honesty, and then is looking for ways around it. I have filed 19 homestead contests in Modoc County. He said it without preface and without softening, because there was no preface or softening that would make it better, and apparently he understood that. Everyone filed to put a relinquishment in my hands before the 5 years came due. Everyone I let the filing family prove up as far as they could first, so the paperwork would look clean when I sold to the cattle company. The yard was very quiet. I did it to your filing on Tully Flat. His voice dropped not out of shame but out of the acoustic phenomenon of a man getting closer to the center of something. 4 years ago, I filed a contest on your improvements after your wife died. I told the land office your cultivation was insufficient. It was not. I held the relinquishment for 30 days and sold it. Ellis made a sound, not a word. A sound. Silas Ward's face did not change, not with anger, not with grief, not with anything that could be named as a single emotion, because what moved through it was too complex for a single name. He stood in his canvas work pants, and his old good boots, and his slate-gray flannel shirt, and he looked at the man who had taken his land in the first year after he had put Clara in the ground, and the boys had needed somewhere to stand, and his face held all of it without letting any of it loose. He was the most controlled person Corinne had ever stood near in a moment of genuine extremity. Not because he felt less, because he had decided, somewhere deep in the construction of who he was, that feeling more did not mean showing more, and that showing less did not mean being less, and that the space between what a man felt and what a man did was the space in which character actually lived. She thought, I have been watching this man for 2 weeks, and I did not know this about him until right now. And now I know it, and I cannot unknow it. Pruitt reached into the breast pocket of his frock coat. His hand was not steady. He pulled out a folded document, folded many times, the paper soft at the creases from handling, the kind of soft that meant it had been opened and refolded often over a long time, the Tully Flat relinquishment. He held it with both hands, level towards Silas Ward. I never sold it. I've kept it 9 years. I couldn't have told you why until this month. He held it steady despite the unsteady hand. It's yours to refile on if the office will take it. I'll write to them myself and state that the original contest was in error. My error. Silas Ward looked at the document for a long moment. He looked at it the way he looked at fences and roofs and corners of turned ground, with the full attention of a man who was making an assessment that mattered and was not going to shortcut it for the sake of appearances. Then he stepped forward. He was large in the way that changed the dimensions of a space, and he was walking toward Denton Pruitt, and for a moment the geometry of it was unclear in the way that geometries are unclear when the largest element in them is in motion. Pruitt did not step back. He held his ground. Whether from courage or from the understanding that there was nowhere better to be, Corinne couldn't tell. Silas Ward took the document from Pruitt's hands. He looked at it. The folded paper, soft at the creases, 9 years of a man's unresolved conscience visible in its handling. He looked at it for long enough to read it, and then for a moment longer that was not reading. Then he put it in the breast pocket of his flannel shirt, against his chest, where it sat flat under the fabric, and he put his hand out. Pruitt looked at that hand, the hand of the man whose land he had taken in the year that same man had buried his wife and been left with 2 sons and no ground to stand on. He looked at it for a moment that seemed longer than it was. Then he took it. They shook hands once. A single grip. The kind that didn't need to last long because it wasn't ceremonial. It was simply the physical fact of an acknowledgement between 2 men who had arrived at the end of something. Won't ask you to call it even, Pruitt said. His voice was the voice of a man who has put something down that was very heavy and is not yet certain how to stand without the weight of it. Corinne looked at Silas Ward. He was looking at their hands which had released. He was not looking at Pruitt. Nobody's calling anything even. Her own voice surprised her. Not the content, she had meant to say something like it, but the evenness of it. The way it came out, not with anger or satisfaction, but with the plain tone of a fact being stated. You took something that wasn't yours to take, and a man is getting back a piece of what it cost him. That's not even. It's just less wrong than it was. Pruitt looked at her. Something in his expression settled. As though less wrong than it was precisely the counting he had been hoping for and not expecting to receive. He put his hat back on. Slowly. The way you put on a hat when you're not in a hurry to get anywhere because you're not certain where you're going next. He walked back to his horse and untied it and mounted without ceremony and rode back down the lane to the county road and turned south. Corinne watched him go until he was past the section corner. Then she turned back to the yard. Ellis was standing exactly where he had been. The step forward he'd taken was still visible in his posture. The weight forward, the jaw set. A young man who had been ready for something different and was now in the process of standing down from that readiness. Grant was at the corner of the barn. He had come from wherever he'd been when the horse arrived, and he had said nothing the whole time. And his face had the expression of someone who's understood that some things needed to be witnessed rather than participated in. Silas Ward was looking at the pocket of his shirt where the relinquishment sat. Not touching it, just acknowledging it. Tule flat, Corinne said. He looked at her. You can file on it again. He said he'd write to the office. I heard him. Good land. 1.5 miles from your north line. She said it simply, without weight, as though she were discussing the weather or the condition of the road. He looked at her for a long moment in the afternoon light, which was the thin and sideways light of a late October afternoon, in that part of California, the kind of light that makes everything look a little more permanent than it is, a little more decided. Yes, he said, that was all. But the word held more than one meaning, and they both knew it, and neither of them moved to clarify which meaning was being addressed, because some clarifications are better left to a later hour. Ellis made a sound that was not quite a word, somewhere between a cleared throat and a sigh, and turned back toward the barn. Grant looked at his boots and almost smiled and did not. And Corinne Hale went inside to start supper, because Denton Pruitt had left and Silas Ward had a relinquishment in his breast pocket, and the light was going, and there were 4 people on the property who were going to be hungry before long, and a homestead didn't pause its requirements, because something significant had happened in the yard. It never had before. It wasn't going to start now. She put the pot on. She cut the last of the week's bread into thick slices. She added a piece of wood to the cook stove fire and listened to the sound of it catch. Outside, the open and closed in around Juniper Bench the way evenings did this time of year, without drama, without announcement, just the slow lowering of the available light until the lamp on the table was what the kitchen ran on. She lit it, and the kitchen came up warm around her, and she stood in that warmth for a moment, with her hand still on the lamp glass, listening to the yard sounds, the barn door, footsteps on frozen ground, the low exchange of voices between 3 men who had come through something together that afternoon, and were now moving through the ordinary necessities of the end of a day. Ordinary, after all of that. Because ordinariness was what a homestead demanded and what people who worked homesteads learned to give it, even on the days that were not ordinary, even on the days when something shifted in the yard and the world rearranged itself around the shift. She turned back to the pot. She added salt. She did not think about the relinquishment in the breast pocket of the flannel shirt against the chest of the largest man she had ever worked beside, the chest that had the particular quality of, and then she stopped herself, firmly, from completing that thought, because the supper needed salt, and the bread needed slicing, and the lamp needed trimming, and none of those tasks were going to do themselves while she stood in her kitchen, thinking about the quality of a man's chest. She sliced the bread. She called them to supper 20 minutes later, and they came in from the cold and sat at the table and ate, and Silas Ward sat across from her and said very little, and the document in his breast pocket was present in the room, the way a fact is present, not visible but felt, like pressure in the air before weather. After Ellis and Grant had gone to the wagon, and the fire in the grate had burned down to red coal, and the wind outside was picking up from the north the way it did, when the real cold was deciding to arrive, Silas Ward was still at the table. Corinne poured the last of the coffee into 2 mugs without asking. He took his. She took hers. "The land office opens Monday," he said. "I know. I'll ride to Alturas Monday. I know." She held her mug with both hands, the warmth of it moving through her palms. "And then you'll have land of your own again. And then I'll have land of my own again." He said it quietly, the words carrying the weight of 9 years without, and everything those 9 years had contained. Outside, the wind spoke to the eaves of the house, and the coals in the grate shifted once, and the lamp held its small circle of warmth against the November dark that was coming, that was already at the edges of the glass. Corinne thought about the box on the shelf with the important documents, the homestead filing, Raymond's receipts, the deed she would receive in the coming months that make this land hers by law in the way it was already hers by 4 years of keeping it. And then she thought about a man riding to Alturas on Monday to file on a piece of ground 1.5 miles to the north of her own north fence line. 1.5 miles, in homestead terms, in frontier terms, in the terms of the life she had been living for 16 years, since she rode out from the eastern edge of California beside Raymond Hale, on the promise of good grass and better water. 1.5 miles was nothing. 1.5 miles was the distance between a neighbor and a neighbor. Or it was something else, and that was information she was going to sit with for a while, quietly, in the warmth of her own kitchen, with the coffee going cold, and the coals going gray, and the wind coming down from the Warner Range, with the first real intention of winter in it. She could afford to sit with it. She had time now. The fence was standing, and the roof was closed, and the contest was withdrawn, and the examiner had ridden back to Alturas and written his notes, and the arithmetic had finally balanced. She had time. Silas Ward rode to Alturas on Monday. He left before Corinne was fully awake, which she knew because she heard the horse on the lane. In that particular darkness that exists between the end of night and the beginning of morning, the darkness that has its own texture, thicker than either side of it. She lay still and listened to the hoofbeats move from the lane to the county road, and then thin out southward until there was nothing left of them but the wind in the eaves. She did not get up to watch him go. She had no reason to watch him go, and several good reasons not to examine her reasons too closely. Ellis and Grant were at the barn when she came out an hour later. They worked the morning without direction, the way they always worked, identifying what was needed and moving toward it without ceremony. Ellis was splitting the remaining knots from last week's wood rounds, the ones that had been set aside because they required more force than efficiency favored in a regular splitting session. He was working them now with a maul that was the right weight for the job, and a precision that spoke to two, knowing the grain before the swing landed. Grant was in the barn doing the kind of quiet maintenance that barns required in the slide toward winter checking tack, sorting harness leather, looking at the things that were almost worn through, and deciding whether almost was close enough to address now. Corinne did the milking and then stood in the barn for a moment after, hand still on the cow's flank, thinking about 1.5 miles. She had been thinking about 1.5 miles for 3 days. The thinking was not productive in the conventional sense. It wasn't arriving anywhere or producing conclusions she could act on. It was more the way a stream works at a channel, not with intention but with persistence, wearing something gradually into a shape. She went inside and made breakfast for 3. Silas Ward came back from Alturas in the late afternoon, with the relinquishment filed and a receipt from the land office in his shirt pocket in place of the document that had been there since Sunday. He tied the horse at the post without particular announcement and came to the kitchen door and knocked. He always knocked, and when Corinne opened it he said, "It's filed." They received Pruitt's letter. There's no contest on record, and the land office took the filing without question. "Good," she said, and then, because good was insufficient and she knew it, "Come in. There's coffee and it's still hot." He came in and sat at the table, and accepted the coffee and sat with it in both hands the way he sat with everything that was warm, not consuming it, not hurrying it, simply receiving it as a fact worth receiving. He had ridden 12 miles in November cold, and his cheeks had the high color of outdoor exertion, and his hat had a dampness at the brim from the fog that came up the valley in the afternoons now. She sat across from him. "Tule flat," she said. "Tule flat." A confirmation. A weight lifted and replaced simultaneously with a different weight, which was the weight of beginning again. 40 acres of good ground and a standing well, and what's left of the structures I built the first time, which apparently the cattle company never demolished and never much used. Your house, the shell of it. He looked at the coffee. The door's gone and the window openings are open, and I imagine the floor has seen better decades. But the walls are sound. Stone foundation. I built it to last because I was building it for. He stopped. Started again on a different line. I built it to last. She understood what he had stopped before saying. She did not make him say it. You'll have it habitable before the real snow comes, she said. Not a question. A statement of fact about a man she had watched work for 3 weeks. With Ellis and Grant. Yes. He looked up at her. Though they'll be sleeping in the structure before it's properly finished, which they won't complain about but which I'll know. Men have wintered in worse. They have. A pause. So have women. He said it with a directness that wasn't pointed, just precise. Looking at her in the way he looked at things he was taking seriously. You wintered here alone for 2 years. I wintered here with Raymond for 11 years before that. It wasn't the same winter. No. He was quiet for a moment. Nothing's the same winter when you do it the first time without the person you'd done it with. She got up and refilled his coffee without being asked. She did it because it needed doing, and because she needed a moment of motion. When she sat back down, he was looking at the table, and she looked at the table too, and the two of them sat in the November kitchen with the comfortable and slightly precarious silence of people who have said something true to each other and are now in the aftermath of it. I told Raymond once that I could do anything on this property except live on it alone. She hadn't intended to say that. It came out with the ease of a thing that had been waiting somewhere accessible. He laughed and said the same was true of him, and then he died, and I found out we were both wrong. Silas Ward looked up at her. We could do it alone, she said. We just didn't want to. He held her gaze for a moment that was longer than comfortable and shorter than conclusive. Then he picked up his coffee mug and drank from it and set it down and said, I'll start on Thule Flat tomorrow. The walls first, then the window openings, then the floor. Practical. Back on ground that required action rather than feeling. I'll need to borrow the wagon for the materials run. The wagon's yours when you need it. I'll pay the rate. The rate is whatever you need the wagon for. He looked at her. Almost something. Then he nodded once, and finished his coffee and stood and carried his mug to the wash basin and set it there rather than leaving it on the table, which was the habit of a man who had learned in some long ago household that you carried your own things rather than leaving them for someone else to carry. He put his hat on and went back out into the November afternoon. Corinne sat at the table for a while longer with her own mug and the sound of the wind and the particular quality of a kitchen that has just had someone in it and now doesn't. She noticed it, set that noticing aside for later. The work on Thule Flat began the next morning. It was 1.5 miles north of the Hale Place's north fence line, which meant it was 1.5 miles from the fence that Silas Ward had strung in a single October morning, which meant it was, in practical terms, close enough that a man working there could be back at the Hale Place for the midday meal if he kept a good pace, and close enough that a woman at the Hale Place's north fence could hear, on a still day, the sound of a hammer or a saw or a mallet on a stone if she stood and listened. She did not stand and listen. She had her own work, but she knew the sounds were there. November settled in around Juniper Bench with the resolute thoroughness of a season that had made up its mind. The mornings went below freezing by the second week and stayed there, the pump handle needing work before the water would come, the barn animals requiring more of everything than they did in the warmer months. Corinne moved through the days with the practiced economy of a woman who had learned to do the necessary things in the necessary order and not waste effort on the wrong sequence. And she did not think too much about what was being built 1.5 miles to the north because, thinking about it, didn't make it happen faster, and the days had enough in them already. Silas came back to the Hale Place most evenings. Not every evening, but most. He came because the wagon was kept at the Hale Place and he needed the wagon. He came because there were tools in the Hale barn that he needed, and returning them at the end of each day was the correct thing to do. He came because Corinne made supper for 4, whether or not there were 4 people to eat it, which she told herself was economy and waste prevention, and which she did not examine further. Ellis and Grant came with him. They ate. They talked about the work on Thule Flat, what they had done that day, what the walls had shown them when they got into them, what the floor was going to require. Corinne listened and occasionally asked questions, and occasionally answered questions about materials and methods she knew from building the structures on the Hale place with Raymond over the course of 11 years, and the evenings moved around the table, in the way of evenings that are built around useful conversation and practical problems, which was the most reliable way Corinne had ever found to have an evening that felt worthwhile. After Ellis and Grant went to the wagon, some nights Silas stayed at the table. Not all nights. On the nights he did, neither of them made a formal decision about it. It simply happened the way things happen when two people in proximity are still in the process of learning each other incompletely, in increments with long stretches between the increments where nothing obvious occurred, but something moved in the channel anyway. She learned that he had grown up in Missouri, the younger of 2 sons, and that his father had been a ferry operator on the Missouri River, and his mother had taught him to read from a Bible and 2 almanacs, because those were what she had, and that he had come west at 19, with nothing particular in mind, except the conviction that west was a direction, and he needed a direction. He had found Clara in a town outside Sacramento, the daughter of a mining surveyor who had stayed in California when the boom moved elsewhere, and built a quiet life out of the staying. They had been married 11 years before she died. He did not talk about those 11 years in detail, but referenced them in ways that told Corinne they had been good years. The particular texture of a man's grief was information about the life that preceded it. She learned that he built things to last, not as a point of pride, but as a point of conscience, because he had seen what happened to things that were built for the short term, by people who believed they'd be somewhere else before the short term expired. She told him things in return. Not everything, but things. She told him about coming west at 22 with Raymond, who had been the most optimistic person she had ever been, in sustained proximity to not naively optimistic. Not the optimism of someone who hadn't thought about the alternatives, but optimism as a practice, as a daily discipline, as a choice made each morning against the evidence of what the previous day had cost. She told him about the first winter on the claim, which had been the hardest winter of her life to that point, and the one after which she had understood that she could do things she had not previously thought herself capable of. She told him that she had spent the 2 years since Raymond's death angry at the incompleteness of it, not at Raymond, not at the fever, but at the timing, which had deprived him of the ending he had worked toward, and deprived her of the witnessing of it. He would have been proud of you for finishing it, Silas said. One November evening when the fire was down to red and the wind was doing serious things to the eaves, he would have been insufferably pleased with himself for having chosen me. She said it with the warmth of someone recounting a foible of a person they loved clearly enough to see the foibles. He had a great deal of confidence in his own judgment about people. Usually warranted. Usually. Almost always. A pause. He was wrong about his brother, but that's a longer story. Silas almost smiled. The almost smile had appeared more frequently in November than it had in October. She had catalogued its versions without intending to, the way you catalog things you find yourself looking for. The Thule Flat structure was habitable by the 3rd week of November. Not finished, the floors were rough, and the window openings had oiled cloth rather than glass, and the door was new hung and slightly proud of the frame, and would need adjusting once the wood settled, but habitable, in the sense that meant a man and 2 adult sons would not freeze inside it, which was the relevant criterion for November. Silas showed her on a Sunday afternoon in the last of the month. He did not call it showing her. He said there was a question about the chimney flue draw that he wanted a second opinion on, which was entirely possible as a genuine statement, and which Corinne chose to accept on its face. She rode out on the old mare, the 1.5 miles up the track that ran north from the Hale property line, through scrub sage and November brown bunchgrass, to where the Thule Flat ground leveled into a natural shelf, with the long view east toward the Warner Range. The house sat on that shelf. Stone foundation, as he'd said. Walls of fitted river stone to waist height and hewn lumber above, chinked against wind with a mix of clay and straw that had dried to the color of old bone. The well was 50 feet from the south door, which was a good positioning. The barn, small but sound, was on the eastern side. set to catch the morning sun in the paddock. She stood in the dooryard and looked at it. There was a rightness to how it sat on the ground. Not a grand rightness, it wasn't a grand house. It was a working house, built for the business of living rather than for appearance. But it had the quality of something placed with thought rather than expediency, turned slightly off true north to catch the winter sun in the south window, and turned away from the prevailing winter wind at the same time. The kind of sighting that required knowing the land before you built on it. You sighted it yourself, she said. Clara and I did. He was at the doorway, which was new-framed and plumb, waiting for the door to settle into it. She walked the shelf for 3 mornings in different weather before we decided where to dig the foundation. She said a house should know what kind of weather it lived in before you committed it to a position. Corinne looked at the south window, which was catching what remained of the November afternoon sun in the oiled cloth and diffusing it into the interior in a warm and foggy glow. She was right. She usually was. He said it without the weight that such statements sometimes carry, not grief, not pride, just the plain attestation of fact. Come look at the flue. She went in and looked at the flue, which drew perfectly and didn't need a second opinion. She looked at the fireplace instead, which was fieldstone and well built, and at the rough floors, which were pine and would smooth with use and oil, and at the window that faced east and would catch the Warner Range at dawn. She looked at the ceiling height, which was higher than the standard, because the man who'd built it was taller than the standard and had built it for himself without apology. You'll need glass for the windows before the hard cold, she said. February trip to Alturas. The oiled cloth won't hold a real freeze. It'll hold November and most of December. He was looking at the fireplace. January will require something more. There's glass at the Hale place. 2 panes Raymond bought in the 2nd year that were too large for the window we had and never got cut down. She said it at the floor, at the rough pine. They're sitting in the barn behind the 3rd stall. I don't know what I was keeping them for. He looked at her then. She felt him look at her and did not look up from the floor. Corinne. She looked up. He was across the room from her, which in this room meant 8 feet, which was close enough that she could see the gray of his eyes in the window, light, without difficulty. He was not moving toward her. He was simply standing in the room he had built and looking at her with the direct and unceremonious regard of a man who had decided that indirection was a waste of the time he had. I don't know the correct way to say this, he said. I have thought about it enough to know that there isn't one. So I'm going to say it plainly and let you do what you want with it. Her heart was doing something she had not given it permission to do, which was unhelpful. All right, she said. It came out steadier than she felt. I would like to continue having reasons to be at your place in the evenings. A pause. Reasons beyond the wagon and the tools and the supper, which I am aware are proxies for the actual reason and which I suspect you are also aware of. He waited. She was aware that she was holding her breath and released it with enough discretion that it wasn't audible. She hoped. The glass is in the barn behind the 3rd stall, she said. You can have it whenever you want it. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who is not certain whether he has just been answered or redirected. That was an answer, she said. To which question? To all of them. She looked at the east window and the foggy light coming through the oiled cloth. Some answers don't announce themselves. They just come out looking like practical information. He stood in his stone house, on tully flat ground in the November afternoon, and said nothing for a moment. Then, I'll come for the glass Tuesday. I'll have it out of the 3rd stall. December came in with intention. The first real snow fell on the 4th of the month, not a heavy fall, not the kind that buried fence posts and required the working of roads before animals could move on them, but enough to change the character of the landscape from autumn brown to something muted and permanent looking, the kind of white that said the season had committed. The Warner Range disappeared into cloud for 3 days and came back wearing more of it than before. Silas Ward came to the Hale place with the wagon on Tuesday for the glass panes, and on Wednesday, for reasons that were not the wagon, and by the 2nd week of December the evenings at the kitchen table had assumed a pattern that was no longer provisional, not fixed either, but no longer the careful circling of 2 people who weren't certain what they were orbiting. Ellis noticed. He said nothing about it, which was more eloquent than saying something would have been. He simply adjusted, the way a young man adjusts when the household around him shifts, not with complaint or commentary, just with the quiet competence of someone who has learned to read a room and respond to what he reads. Grant, on the evening he noticed, looked at the table, and then at the ceiling, and then at his supper, with the expression of a man practicing invisibility, which made him considerably more visible, and which Corinne chose to address by refilling his coffee without comment and watching him try not to react. He did not succeed at not reacting. She did not make anything of it. The weeks between December and January were the weeks of the country showing its depth, the cold that came down from the north with the flat authority of something that had been traveling a long distance and had arrived at its destination and saw no reason to moderate itself. The pump required tending every morning. The barn animals were supplemented. The cordwood declined at a rate that was predictable and had been planned for, and was therefore not alarming, just present, a daily accounting. Silas moved the glass into the Thule flat windows on a Saturday in the second week of December, with Ellis doing the fitting, and Grant doing the caulking, and Silas doing the part that required someone tall enough to manage the upper sash without a ladder. Corinne was not there for this. She had not been invited and had not invited herself, and the line between those two things was a line she was being careful with. But she saw the light in the east-facing window the next morning, when she rode the north fence line on her regular inspection, the glass catching the thin December sun and throwing it back sharp and clear where the oiled cloth had been blurring it. A specific and particular change in the landscape. A house with glass in its windows is a different house than a house without. She rode the fence line back to the barn and put the mare up and went inside and stood at the kitchen window for a moment, looking north through her own glass, and thought about the view from the Thule flat window facing south, on a clear day, which this was. The view south from Thule flat would include the Hale Place's north fence line, and the cottonwood at the lane's end, and the ketch roof, and possibly, if the light was right, the kitchen window itself. She thought about that for a moment. Then she made breakfast and went about her day. The question of what they were to each other was not a question either of them asked directly, because the answer was assembling itself in the space between their actual lives and didn't require a formal proceeding to become real. What they were was this: two people who had lost the people they'd built their first lives with, and who had found, in the wreckage and the subsequent years of reconstruction, that they were still themselves, still capable of work and judgment and specific preferences, and the particular kind of humor that comes from having been through enough to know which things are genuinely serious and which only appear so, and who had ended up, through the arithmetic of a land office letter and a newspaper notice, and a day's worth of fence and a fire on an enemy's claim, in the same orbit, on the same stretch of Modoc County ground, with the same north-facing and south-facing views. The winter deepened. January arrived with the indifference of a season that had been waiting its turn, and saw no reason to be gentle about taking it. The second week brought 3 days of real snow, the kind that required roads and the management of them, the kind that put the Warner Range in cloud for a week, and changed the sound of the wind from whistle to something lower and more sustained. Corinne worked the Hale place with the efficiency of someone who had done this before, and knew which tasks could be deferred and which could not. She checked the animals twice daily. She kept the chimney clear. She maintained a path from the house to the barn that the snow tried to refill each night, and she run for each end, bathed in each morning with the shovel Raymond had made from a grain scoop handle and a piece of iron sheeting in the first winter, which had outlasted him by 2 years and showed no sign of stopping. Silas came through the snow on the worst days of the January storm to check the Hale Place's situation, which he did not explain as concern for her specifically, but as the general interest a neighbor takes in a neighboring property, in conditions that make isolation dangerous. She accepted this framing because it was not inaccurate. She also accepted the extra cord of wood he and Ellis split and stacked against the south wall of the house in the first week of the cold, which was above and beyond neighboring and closer to something else, and which she thanked him for with supper and said nothing about categorizing. On the fourth evening of the January storm, when the snow outside the kitchen window was coming horizontal, and the temperature had dropped past the point where cold was a fact of the body and became a fact of the air itself, something in the atmosphere rather than something on the skin, Silas Ward sat across from her at the table, after Ellis and Grant had gone to the barn, which they were sleeping in now, rather than the wagon, because the wagon was too cold for sleeping, and Corinne had offered the barn and they had accepted, and he said, "I'm going to ask you something. You don't have to answer it tonight. Ask it. In the spring," he said, "when the ground thaws and the proving up on Thule Flat can properly begin. I would like to ask you something then that I think I know the answer to now, but that I don't want to ask in January during a snowstorm." She looked at him across the table. The lamp between them threw equal light in both directions, and she could see him clearly, the gray eyes that ran deep, the jaw that he had shaved that morning, in the cold of the Thule Flat house, which showed in the clean line of it, the flannel shirt in the dark red that was his color for cold weather, the hands flat on the table, with the deliberateness of a man keeping them still. "Why not January during a snowstorm?" she said. "Because January during a snowstorm is not a condition. It's a crisis. And I don't want what I'm going to ask to be an answer to a crisis. I want it to be a choice made in clear weather with both of us in full possession of ourselves." She sat with that for a moment. The wind said something to the eaves. The fire in the grate responded in its own language. "That's a reasonable position," she said finally. "It's the only position I know how to hold." He looked at her steadily. "Can you wait until spring? I've been waiting 2 years for the ground to belong to me legally." The warmth in her voice was not performed. "I think I can manage until the thaw." He almost smiled. The real version, not the almost. The one that got all the way to his eyes and changed the color of them slightly, the way light changed the color of water. "Good," he said. She poured the last of the coffee into his mug, and he took it, and they sat in the January kitchen, with the storm against the glass and the fire in the grate, and the full and particular comfort of two people who have agreed to something without yet naming what it is, and who are in no hurry, because they have both learned the hard way and the honest way that hurrying toward the things that matter is not a virtue but a failure of nerve, and that the things worth having are worth arriving at in the right season. Spring came to Modoc County the way it always did, not with a single day of warmth, but with an argument between cold and thaw that went on for 6 weeks before the thaw won. The snow pulled back from the lower ground first, then from the north-facing slopes more slowly, and the sage came green-gray and new-smelling in the low areas, and the Warner Range gave up its white incrementally, acre by acre, until by April the high peaks still wore it, and everything below them had moved on. Silas Ward's proving up on Thule Flat proceeded with the organized forward momentum of a man who had done this before, and knew that proving up was not about grand gestures, but about accumulation, each fence post driven, each furrow turned, each structure improved being another line on the ledger that the land office was eventually going to verify. He had good help. Ellis was 20 now, and worked Thule Flat with the focused application of a young man who understood he was working towards something that would eventually be his own, and the understanding changed the quality of his labor in ways that were visible to anyone paying attention. Grant was 18 and still fluid, where Ellis was methodical, still moving around problems rather than through them, which made him indispensable in ways that methodical couldn't cover. Corinne worked her own the fields that needed turning, the animals that had come through winter and needed their conditions assessed, the barn that wanted the attention of the season, applied to the things that cold and damp had worked on. She did her work and Silas Ward did his, and they were 1.5 miles apart, and not particularly far apart at all. He came to the Hale place one evening in the first week of June, when the light stayed long, and the sage was fully green, and the north fence line had survived its first full winter without losing a post or a wire, and he walked the lane to the house, and she was at the north fence when she saw him coming, and she understood before she reached the fence what the evening was going to contain. He stopped at the fence. She was on the Hale side, and he was on the Thule Flat side, and the fence between them was the fence he had built in a single October morning a full year before, which had been standing through everything that had happened since, with the indifference of good construction. He took his hat off, the same way he had taken it off the first morning, before he had said a word, before he had introduced himself or explained his purpose, or made any case for anything. Just the hat off, in the presence of a woman who warranted the courtesy, held in the hand that had driven 1,000 fence posts and split 2 winters of cord wood and reached across a fire to pull a burning fragment from the edge of a hayrick before it could run. "I said I'd ask you something in the spring," he said. "The ground thawed 6 weeks ago. I wanted to be sure of something first." "What?" That what I was going to say was true and not just seasonally plausible. He looked at her across the fence, direct, the way he looked at everything that mattered. "I'm not a man who has much to offer in the conventional sense. I have a claim that's a year into 5 years of proving up. 2 sons who are grown enough to not require managing, but young enough to be present. A house with glass in the windows now, and floors that have been oiled twice, and a chimney that draws without question. That's not nothing. It's not nothing," he agreed without deflecting. "And I have a fence I built once for free, that's been standing for a year without your having to touch it, which I think counts for something given that you've checked it approximately twice a week since October." She looked at him. "You noticed." "I notice most things." His voice was even. "I noticed the first morning that you went up the catch roof rather than ask for help. I noticed that you check the northeast corner of the field every time you've walked the perimeter even though it's been clear of cheatgrass since October because you can't yet trust it to stay clear. I noticed that you pour coffee for other people before you pour it for yourself, and that you always know where your work gloves are, and that you don't ask questions you don't actually want answered." She was quiet for a moment, not because she lacked a response, because she was taking inventory of a man who had apparently been paying a considerable amount of attention, while she was paying attention to other things. "I noticed," she said slowly, "that you build things to the specification of someone who intends to live with them for a long time. That you shave even in January, even at the Thule flat house when you could reasonably not bother. That you have never once in 8 months raised your voice, but you are not a gentleman. You are a man who has decided not to be loud, which is not the same thing and is considerably more difficult." He looked at her. "And I noticed," she continued, quieter now, "that the last time I checked this fence, I stopped at the middle post and put my hands on the wire the same way I have 100 times. And what I thought about was not Raymond and not the examiner and not the cheatgrass and not the deed that came from Alturas in February and is in the box on the shelf. I thought about a man who built this fence because the work needed doing and then stayed because she stopped. He waited. Because staying was what made sense," she finished, "and I would like it to continue making sense." The June evening put long light across the sage and the fence wire, and the Thule flat ground to the north, and the Hale ground to the south, and the half-mile of it between the canyon edge and the county road that ran north-south through Juniper Bench. "Corinne Hale," he said, with the gravity of a man stating a complete sentence that he has considered fully, "I would like to ask you to marry me. I would like to do it at this fence in June, with the ground warm and both of us in clear weather." She put her hand on the top wire between them, the wire he had strung. "Yes," she said, "at this fence, in this weather." A pause that was not hesitation but the natural space around a word that was carrying considerable weight. "Yes." He put his hand over hers on the wire. His hand was larger than hers by a margin that was simply a fact, a physical proportion like the fact of the Warner Range being taller than the Sage, a fact without judgment or competition. Warm from the June afternoon, solid from the work of a lifetime. They stood at the fence in the long evening light and did not say anything further for a moment because nothing further needed saying. Ellis came around the corner of the Hale barn and stopped dead. He looked at his father's hand on the fence wire over Corinne's hand. He looked at his father's face, which was doing the thing it almost never did fully open, nothing held back, the whole of the man visible in the set of it. He looked at Corinne. She looked back at him steadily, the way she looked at everything she wasn't going to apologize for. Ellis turned around and went back around the barn. From the other side of the barn, audible in the June quiet, Grant's voice muffled. "What?" "Nothing." A pause. "Supper's going to be in a while." "How long a while?" "Longest pause yet. Give it some time." Corinne looked at Silas Ward. He was looking at the corner of the barn where Ellis had disappeared, and the expression on his face was the one she thought of as the almost smile, except it had gotten all the way there this time and was not moving back. "He knew," she said. "He's known since November." The smile stayed. "He's been very patient. Grant too? Grant told me in January that if I was planning to say something, I should say it before the spring frame planting, because he didn't want the conversation to happen in the middle of a busy season. She absorbed this. I like them. They're good men. Simple. True. The plain attestation of a father who could see his sons clearly, without the distortion of either too much pride or too much familiarity. They'll be glad. Ellis was already glad, she said. He's just practicing restraint. He's been practicing it for several months. Silas looked back at her, his hand still on hers on the wire. He'll be relieved to stop. They got married in September, which was when Modoc County was at its most honest, the heat of summer behind it, the serious cold not yet arrived, the sage at full silver, the Warner Range showing the first snow on its highest peaks, while the lower country was still warm enough to stand in without a coat, the kind of weather that required no apology and made no promises it couldn't keep. The whole of Juniper Bench came. This was not an exaggeration. The story of the fence and the fire had been told enough times in the preceding year to have taken on the properties of a local account that people referenced without ceremony the examiner who came Thursday morning, the hayrick that didn't burn, the man who showed up with 2 grown sons and strung 3/4 of a mile of fence in 4 hours. People who had been at their own properties that Wednesday had heard the story enough times that they felt almost present for it, and people who had been present told it with the economy of true witnesses, which was that they let the facts carry the weight and didn't embellish what didn't need embellishing. The ceremony was held in the yard of the Hale place, under a canvas canopy that Ellis and Grant had built on a frame the previous day, working in the easy collaborative way they had worked everything. Ellis on the structure, Grant on the details, neither needing to negotiate the division because they had arrived at it through the accumulation of a working life shared. Silas Ward in a dark wool vest and a white dress shirt and a cravat that Corinne tied for him 3 times, before he held still enough for it to come out right, which she told him and which he accepted without protest, standing with the resigned patience of a man who understands that there are forms of cooperation in which his contribution is primarily to not move. He was the tallest person present by the margin. He was always the tallest person present by. The canvas canopy had been framed generously, and he still had to watch the center beam. He watched it with the practiced awareness of a man who had been watching beams, door frames, and overhead obstacles his entire adult life, without making a production of it. Corinne wore the dove-gray wool dress she had married Raymond in. She had taken it out of the cedar trunk at the beginning of September and looked at it for a long time before she decided. Not because she was uncertain about marrying Silas Ward, because she was being deliberate about what it meant to wear the dress again. She had decided that it meant this: a good dress was made to be worn on the occasions that warranted it, and she had been given, against all reasonable probability, 2 such occasions, and wearing the dress to both of them was not a confusion of one for the other, but an acknowledgement that both were real, and both deserved the best she had. She wore it. It fit as it had fit 16 years before, because she was the same woman who had worn it then, older in the places that mattered and unchanged in the ones that didn't, and the gray of the wool was the gray of the October sky, and the gray of Silas Ward's eyes, and the gray of the Warner Range above the timberline, which was a coincidence she noticed and did not mention, because some things were better kept as private observations. The minister read the words that ministers read. They said theirs. Silas's voice was what it always was, level, not quiet and not loud, carrying the weight of the words without pressing them into shapes they didn't naturally fit. Corinne's voice did not waver. She had spent 2 years proving up on land that was not yet legally hers and weathering the specific fear that she would lose it. And she had learned in that time that wavering was not the same as doubting, and steadiness was not the same as certainty, but that you could choose steadiness anyway and mean it. She meant it. The oldest man present in Juniper Bench, a neighbor who had been on his claim since before the county road was graded, stood up after the ceremony with his hat in his hand and his voice carrying the confident projection of a man who had spent decades speaking across distances that required it. "Haleward Place," he said. "Long may it stand." The yard repeated it in the way that gathered people repeat things that feel correct. Not a rehearsed response, but a collective recognition, the sound of a community, confirming what it already knew to be true. The name had been in use informally since November, since the first person who needed to describe the situation on the north end of Juniper Bench had used it and found it accurate and passed it on. Now it was formal, witnessed, set. Ellis stood beside his father for the ceremony. He had the posture of a young man doing something important, and knowing it, the measured stillness of someone who had decided that the right way to honor an occasion was to be fully present for it without decoration. He shook hands with Corinne afterward with a directness that was entirely his father's, and then said quietly, so that only she could hear, "I've been hoping since November." And then, because he was Ellis and had been practicing restraint for 8 months, I wanted to say that once. I won't make a habit of it. Grant, when he came to her, simply looked at her for a moment with the considering expression he brought to things he was taking seriously, and then said, "Thank you for the coffee," which meant something entirely other than coffee, and which she understood perfectly, and which was the most Grant sentence that had ever been spoken in Modoc County. The September afternoon held its warmth until the sun was nearly down, and the canopy came down with it, and the neighbors went to their horses, and their wagons, and their own properties in the gathering dusk, and the yard of the Hale Ward place held the aftermath of the kind of afternoon that leaves a particular quality of silence when it's over, not emptiness but fullness, the silence of a vessel that has been used for its purpose and is not yet put away. Corinne stood at the north fence in the late light, because she always stood at the north fence in the late light when she needed to think, and habit was habit, even on a day that was not ordinary. Silas Ward came and stood beside her, not at a distance, beside her. In the particular geography of two people who have decided to occupy the same piece of ground, the physical fact of it rearranging the space between them into something that had the specific and irreversible quality of home. The Warner Range caught the last of the light on its high peaks, and held it a moment longer than the lower country, the way high things do, and then let it go. The fence ran north exactly as far as it was supposed to run. The deed arrived from Alturas on a February morning in 1889, 5 months after the wedding. Carried up the lane by the postal rider, who had adjusted his route book without being asked, and who handed it over with the unremarkable efficiency of a man delivering something he did not know the weight of. Corinne knew the weight of it. She read it at the kitchen table. Not by lamplight this time. The February morning was clear and cold, and the sun came through the south window at a low angle that put a bar of light directly across the document in her hands, which she took as neither sign nor coincidence, but simply as the way light behaved in February at this latitude. The deed was what deeds were: language precise to the point of austerity, the kind of language that had been refined by 100 years of property disputes into something that left no room for interpretation. The land was hers, the acreage, the boundaries, the water rights, all of it enumerated and confirmed and signed by the appropriate office. She folded it along the crease the postal rider had put in it, and opened the box on the shelf and placed it inside, next to the original filing and Raymond's equipment receipt and the letter from the Women's Agricultural Society that had come the previous week, requesting an interview for the county homestead record. She closed the box. She stood at the shelf for a moment, with her hand on the box lid, and thought about a Tuesday morning in October of 1888, which was 16 months ago, and also a different life in the way that certain elapsed time is a different life, rather than merely a different season. The letter that had been in her apron pocket that morning was gone. She had burned it in the grate the night after the examiner rode back to Alturas, because she saw no reason to keep a document whose only function had been to threaten her. The box held the things worth keeping. The deed was now among them. She took her hand off the box. Silas was at the south pasture gate when she came outside, rehinging the left side that had been dropping since November. He had the gate off its post and was fitting the new iron pintles he'd had made in Alturas on the February supply run, working with the focused attention of a man who understood that a gate hung correctly would last 30 years, and a gate hung incorrectly would need attention every spring. He looked up when she came across the yard. She held up nothing. She said nothing. She simply looked at him in the February morning light. He looked back at her for a moment. Then he looked at the gate. then back at her. "Done," he said. "Not a question." "Done," she confirmed. He nodded once, and went back to the pintles, which was exactly the right response, and she had known before she crossed the yard that it would be, and the knowing had been part of why she came outside rather than waiting for him to come in. Some news wanted ceremony. This news wanted the plain acknowledgement of a man who understood that the done thing required no elaboration beyond the fact of its being done. She went back inside and started the midday meal. The south pasture gate hung true by noon. She heard the sound of it, the specific sound of a gate that closes correctly. A clean flat contact, without the secondary wobble of a hinge that has not been set at the right angle, and she noted it from the kitchen, the way she noted the sounds of the place, which was the ongoing sensory inventory of a woman who had been the sole responsible party for this property for 2 years, and had developed, in that time, an acute awareness of its acoustic register. The Hale Ward place ran 2 homesteads as one operation through the proving up years that followed, which required the kind of daily coordination that 2 people either develop naturally or don't develop at all, and which Corinne and Silas developed without apparent effort, because their working styles were compatible in the specific way that made coordination feel like agreement rather than negotiation. She managed the Hale grounds cultivation schedule and the livestock and the domestic operations of the main house. He managed the Thule flat improvements and the heavy construction and the supply runs to Alturas that the combined operation required. Between them, Ellis worked Thule flat with the focused application of a young man building toward something specific, and Grant moved between both properties and then increasingly beyond them as his reputation for fence work extended into neighboring counties. Grant left for his first extended job in Lassen County in the spring of 1890. He came back with money and a story about a canyon fence that had required him to invent a new method for spanning a 40-foot drop, which he described at the supper table with the self-deprecating precision of someone who had solved a serious problem and found the solution more interesting than the credit. Ellis listened to the description without interrupting, and at the end said, "Did it hold?" Grant, "Still holding." Ellis, "Then it worked." Grant looked at the ceiling with the expression of a man who had expected a longer response and was recalibrating. "That's all you want to know. That's all that matters, Silas." Across the table, eating his supper with the tranquility of a man who had been watching this dynamic for 20 years and had reached a complete peace with it. "He's right." Grant looked at Corinne. She kept her eyes on her plate, because she was also right, but there was no version of saying so that would improve the situation. The winter of 1890 was the winter she told Silas about the child. February again. The kitchen again. But not the same light. This February had been overcast for a week, and the morning was gray and flat. The kind of flat gray light that made everything in the kitchen look very present and very still, the lamp unnecessary but lit, because the gray was heavy enough to warrant it. She had been sitting with the information for 3 weeks, which was long enough to be certain, and not so long that keeping it became its own form of dishonesty. He was across the table, coffee in front of him. Hat on the hook by the door because inside the house he kept it on the hook, and outside he put it on, and the line between inside and outside was one of the few divisions he maintained with something close to ritual consistency. "I think," she said, "that we're going to need to add a room." He looked at her. He was a man who assembled pictures from available information, and he had sufficient information, and he was very still for a moment, in the way of a man who has received something he was hoping for, and is making certain he has received it correctly before he responds to it. He put his coffee down. He stood up and walked around the table, and stood behind her chair and placed his hands on her shoulders, not heavy, not demonstrative, exactly the weight that the moment asked for and no more. She felt the specific and familiar solidity of them, those hands that had driven posts and built houses and reached into fire, resting on her now with a care that had nothing to do with fragility and everything to do with intention. "We'll add a room," he said. She put one hand up and covered his. The fire in the grate said something. The gray morning pressed against the window glass. Outside, the Hale Ward place sat in the February cold exactly as it had sat through every variety of weather it had encountered, since before either of them arrived at it, and would continue sitting after both of them were done with it. carrying the mark of how they had treated it into whatever came next. Ellis built the room in May of that year, before the heat arrived and made the work miserable. He put it on the south side of the house, where the winter sun would find the window, and he framed it with the finished consciousness of someone who understood that the room was for a specific and anticipated person, and that person deserved the same care as any other structural element on the property. He hung the door with the precision he brought to every hung door, since his father had taught him that a door hung wrong announced itself every single time it was used, which was not the kind of announcement a door should be making. Grant came back from Lassen County for the frame-raising weekend. He worked the framing without commentary for 4 hours, which for Grant was the equivalent of profound restraint. And then at lunch under the cottonwood he said, "I told my crew I had a family obligation. They asked what kind. A pause that was doing a great deal of work. I said it was a room situation. Ellis, not looking up Grant. I told them very little." "How little?" "Mostly nothing." Grant examined his sandwich with sudden interest. "The word mostly is doing some work in that sentence, I'll admit." Corinne looked at Silas. He was eating with the untroubled expression of a man whose son's dynamic had been transparent to him for 2 decades, and who had arrived at a settled acceptance of it as a fixed feature of the landscape. "They've been doing this since Ellis could form complete sentences," he said. "Ellis, Grant could form them first. Grant earlier, not better." "Both accurate," Silas said. To Corinne, settling nothing, just confirming. She ate her lunch and listened and felt the specific quality of a life in full motion, not between its important moments but inside them. All of it running together, the ordinary and the significant in the same current, the frame going up on the south side of the house, and the conversation under the cottonwood, and the lunch, and the May warmth on her shoulders, all part of the same unbroken thing. Raymond had called it the fullness. Once, on a June afternoon in the 3rd year of their marriage, sitting in a different configuration of the same yard, he had said that word, and she had not understood it precisely until she had lived without it for 2 years, and then found it again through a different door. Margaret Hale Ward was born in October of 1890, which was the 3rd October since the letter arrived on a Tuesday, and which was, Corinne noted privately, a Thursday the same day of the week as the examiner's visit, though she assigned no significance to this, and mentioned it to no one, because it was the kind of observation that invited the wrong kind of meaning, a daughter. Silas sat beside the bed for a long time after, holding her with the focused and slightly formal attention of a man who had held sons, and understood the general principle of holding small people, but was recalibrating for a specific person he had not met before. He held her the way he checked fence wire, not with pressure but with attention, reading the integrity of the thing through contact rather than assessment, making certain, without making certain that he was making certain. Ellis came to the doorway of the new room and stood there and looked at the child and at his father and at Corinne, and did the thing he did when situations exceeded his available vocabulary, which was to be silent, in a way that was not empty, but full the silence of a person who has assessed the situation and found it to be what it needed to be and has no amendments to offer. He nodded once. Then he went back to whatever he had been doing, which was the correct response and which Corinne had expected, and which moved her more than an elaborate response would have. Grant arrived from Lassen County 2 days later. He sat on the foot of the bed and looked at Margaret for a long and considering moment. Then, "She already looks like she has questions." "She's 2 days old," Corinne said. "Some people start early." He looked at the child with the expression of someone making a genuine assessment. "I started early. It's a reasonable quality." Margaret did have questions. They became apparent within the first months of her life, in the specific way that questions are apparent in very young people, before language is available to carry them through the directed attention of an infant who looked at things with the focused interest of someone building a picture rather than simply receiving sensation. She watched. She tracked. She noticed when things changed and registered the change with the small and serious expression of someone updating a record. By the time she was walking, she had opinions about the fence. This was not a metaphor. She had accompanied Corinne on the fence walks since she was old enough to walk at the pace required, which was slow enough for short legs and deliberate enough for a woman, checking something that had stood for 2 years without requiring a check, and she had studied the fence with the interested attention of a child who had been told the story of its building and found the story's specifics worth holding on to. She knew the details. She had requested them enough times that knowing them was complete: the date, the hour the first post went in, the 3/4 of a mile that had stood unstrung for 2 years and then wasn't. She knew about Ellis and the auger and Grant on the roof, and the bales of wire from the wagon and the cheat grass corner, and the examiner who had come on a Thursday and written his notes without ceremony and ridden back to Alturas. She asked once, walking the fence in the October of her 4th year, about the post at the grade change, the one set deeper than the others. Corinne told her about the slope and the load and the decision made without discussion on the first morning by a man who had set enough posts to understand what a slope required before the problem had time to announce itself. Margaret walked to the post and put her hand on it at the height her arm could reach and stood there for a moment, with the particular stillness of a child doing something that felt important, though she could not have said precisely what. Corinne stood back and let her stand there, because some things were better witnessed than directed. Because the child with her hand on the fence post was doing something that Corinne had been doing for 6 years, and which she could not have fully explained to anyone who asked, but which she understood completely: the act of verifying through contact that a thing built correctly was still correctly built, that the care taken in a single morning had held through the subsequent seasons and was still holding, that the investment of proper attention at the beginning continued to pay its return long after the attention had moved on to other things. The following spring, 1895, Silas Ward's proving up on Tully Flat reached its 5-year mark, and the deed came from Alturas in March: 40 acres of ground with a standing well and a stone foundation house, and 28 acres under cultivation and fence along all 4 sides, that Ellis had strung himself in the 3rd year of proving up because he had learned from a man who built things to last that fencing your own ground was not a task to defer. He moved the last of his belongings from the Hale Ward barn to the Tully Flat house on a Saturday in April. He did this without ceremony, which was his mode for most transitions, and without announcement beyond telling Corinne and Silas at breakfast that he was going to make the last load that afternoon. He went. He came back for supper, and when he sat at the Hale Ward table that evening, he sat at it as a neighbor rather than a resident, which was a different position, and which he occupied with the same directness he occupied every position he found himself in. Silas watched his older son across the table, with the expression Corinne had come to associate with a specific kind of parental satisfaction, not pride in the conventional sense, not the pride that required display, but the quieter thing that looked more like recognition, the recognition of a quality in another person that you did not teach them and cannot take credit for, but are nevertheless glad to see in the world. "The northeast corner of the Tully Flat ground," Silas said. "How's the drainage running after the spring melt?" "Ellis east side needs another 6 inches of fall." "I know. I dug it that way on purpose." Ellis looked at his father. "So I'd find it, so you'd fix it. There's a difference." Silas ate his supper. "You'll know the ground better for having fixed a problem I left in it than for having inherited a ground with no problems." Ellis sat with that for a moment. Then he ate his supper too. And Margaret, who was 4 years old and eating her supper at the other end of the table, with the focused efficiency she brought to meals, looked up and said, "What's drainage?" which opened a conversation that lasted through the clearing of the table and into the first hour of the evening, and which Margaret followed with the same directed attention she brought to everything that involved the ground and how it worked, which was most things that interested her. Grant was in Shasta County by then, running a crew of 6 on a ranch fence job that had been recommended to him by the man who'd recommended him to Lassen County, who had heard about it from the man who'd hired him in Easton Modoc, the sequence of referrals being the specific evidence of a reputation built job by job without any other architecture. He came back to Juniper Bench 4 times a year, and was louder at the table each time in the way of a man whose life had more space in it than most, and who was accustomed to filling the space he occupied. He was good with Margaret in a way that surprised him each visit, as though he arrived expecting to find the same child he had left, and found instead a version several increments further along than anticipated, with interests and opinions and questions that his particular kind of attention was well suited to address. He answered her questions about fence and terrain, and the behavior of ground under different conditions with the specificity of a practitioner, rather than the simplification of an adult talking to a child. Because Margaret's questions, the questions of a child asking for entertainment, but the questions of a small person building a genuine understanding of something and needing accurate information to build with. She remembered everything he told her. This became apparent on his subsequent visits when she referenced earlier conversations with the accuracy of someone who had filed the information correctly the first time. Grant mentioned this to Silas on a June evening in 1895, sitting on the porch after supper with the long light coming flat across the sage. "Silas, I know, Grant, she's going to know more about fence than I do by the time she's 10. Probably, that's not a problem." "No," Silas said. "It's not." The summer of 1895 brought a woman from the Modoc County Women's Agricultural Society to the Hale Ward place on a Thursday afternoon in August, which Corinne noted and did not remark on, because Thursdays had a particular registry in her personal accounting of things and she had stopped being surprised by their weight. The woman was thorough and warm, and she asked good questions in the sequence of someone who had done this interview before and understood what the record needed to contain. She asked about the filing and the proving up and the examiner and the fire. She asked about the relinquishment and Denton Pruitt and what had happened in the yard in October of 1888. She asked about the wedding and the deed and the Tuley Flat operation and how the two homesteads ran as one. She asked about Silas Ward, and she asked, near the end, with the patience of someone who had been waiting for the conversation to reach the right place, "What would you want the record to hold, if you had to say one thing?" Corinne sat with the question, not because the answer was uncertain, but because it was complete, and she wanted to give it without short-changing it. "That the work goes faster when nobody's made to stand and watch it," she said. "My husband said it first, but I think I had been living it before I knew how to say it." The woman wrote it down. She wrote it in the same careful hand she had used for everything else in the record, the fence, and the examiner, and the fire, and the Tuley Flat relinquishment, and the names and the dates, and she wrote it without comment, which was correct, because a statement that true did not need commentary any more than a well-set post needed a sign explaining that it was well set. The record was filed in Alturas in September of 1895, and sat in the county archive in the folder marked Juniper Bench, Hale Ward Homestead, a few shelves from the original homestead filing, and the deed of February 1889, and a yellowed relinquishment document for a piece of ground called Tuley Flat that had never been sold, had been held 9 years by a man who couldn't have told you why. Until the October afternoon, he handed it across a gate to the man it had been taken from. The years moved through the Hale Ward place in the way that good years move through good ground, not without difficulty, not without the losses that any working life accumulates, but with the particular forward motion of a thing that's been correctly established, and is therefore building on itself, rather than compensating for what wasn't done right at the beginning. The south pasture gate that Silas had refit February of 1889 needed a new pintle in 1897, and nothing else for another decade after that. The catch roof that Corinne had shingled herself in the October of 1888 was reshingled in 1898, when the original shakes finally completed their useful life, which was 10 years, exactly the life a properly installed shake was supposed to give, and the reshingling took 2 days rather than an afternoon, because nobody was working against a government deadline, and so the work could be done correctly rather than quickly, which was a luxury that Corinne acknowledged each time she looked at the ridge. The north fence line did not require repair in the first decade. It required checking. She walked it twice a week through the first years, and then once a week, and then on a schedule that was less regular but no less consistent in its occurrence, which was not a schedule at all but a habit, and habits are more durable than schedules because they don't depend on the calendar to remind you of their existence. She walked it in the October mornings before the household was awake, in the flat gray light before the sun cleared the Warner Range, in her heavy boots and the wool shawl off the hook by the door, her breath in small visible clouds, the frost still on the grass, the wire showing no light yet because the light had not arrived. She walked it and put her hand on the posts at intervals, the corner post, the grade change post, the post at the halfway point that had gone in last because it was the one farthest from the wagon on the first morning, and Ellis had had to carry the auger the full distance in the October cold, and she checked the tension with her palms, the way Silas had checked it on the first day, because he had taught her, without intending to teach her, that checking a thing correctly meant checking it with your hands and not just your eyes. She checked it not because it needed checking. The fence was sound. She had verified its soundness enough times to have a complete and settled confidence in its continued soundness. She checked it because the checking was what she needed, which was different from the fence needing it, and which she had understood clearly since the third year of doing it, and had stopped trying to justify to herself since the fourth. A thing built right in a single day by hands that had no reason to build it, for you did not stop requiring your acknowledgement just because time had passed, and the threat that made the building urgent was gone. The threat was gone, the fence remained, and the fence remaining the specific and physical fact of its presence on the north line. Every morning she walked out to verify it was information she required in the way that some people require certain sounds or certain lights to confirm that the world is correctly ordered, that the things which happened and have not been undone by the passage of time and the accumulation of seasons. Margaret began walking the fence with her in the autumn of Margaret's fourth year, 1894, when her legs were long enough for the pace and her attention sufficient for the distance. She walked it the way she walked everything, with a seriousness of purpose that sat slightly at odds with her size, as though her interior dimensions were larger than her exterior ones, and the mismatch was visible in the way she moved through spaces she had decided were worth her full attention. She did not chatter on the fence walks. She observed. She asked occasional questions that were so specific they suggested she had been saving them since the previous walk which she had. One October morning in 1896, the morning of her 6th birthday, she walked the full line from the barn end to the far corner and back without saying anything until they reached the grade change post on the return. Then she stopped and put both hands on the post itself, not the wire, the post, and held them there for a moment. "It doesn't move," she said. "No, the others move a little. When I push." She demonstrated on the adjacent post, which had the minimal give of a correctly set post in ground that had expanded and contracted through 7 winters, and was still solid but was not the same solid as new. "This one doesn't. Because it's deeper. Because of the slope." She had this piece of information. She was fitting it to the physical evidence. The slope pulls on it more than the flat ground pulls on the others. Yes. She kept her hands on the post, looking at the wire. The October morning put long shadows from the fence posts across the frost-white grass, each shadows exact and parallel, the fence's own record of itself rendered in light and cold. "He knew to go deeper," she said. Not a question. The statement of someone confirming a conclusion, before the first post went in. Yes. She took her hands off the post. She looked at Corinne with the direct regard that was her father's primary mode of engaging with anything important, and which she had apparently received without modification. How did he know? Corinne looked at the post, at the wire, at the grade dropping away toward the gully, the same grade it had been on the morning in October of 1888, when a man she had met 3 hours earlier had looked at it and known what it required and addressed it without discussion or announcement. Because he had been wrong before, she said, about a different fence, on a different slope, in a different year. And the wrong thing had taught him what the right thing needed to be. Margaret considered this with the focused interior process that her considering always involved. Then, so knowing what you did wrong is how you know what to do right. It's one way, is it the best way? Corinne looked at her daughter in the October morning, 6 years old, and standing at the grade change post of a fence that had been built before she existed by people who had not yet become her parents, asking questions about the relationship between error and knowledge, with the seriousness of someone who intended to use the answer. "It's the most reliable way," she said, "because you can't forget a lesson that cost you something." Margaret nodded. The single definitive nod. Information received, filed correctly. Moving on. They walked back to the barn end in the October light, the frost lifting now as the sun cleared the range, the wire beginning to catch the first thin gleam of the morning. The Hale Ward place came into view as they rounded the barn corner, the house with its south window and its carefully fitted door, the ketch with the second-generation shakes, the cottonwood at the lane's end gone gold and silver in the fall morning, the gate that hung true on its pintles and had hung true for 7 years. Margaret stopped at the gate and looked back at the fence line. Corinne stopped beside her. They stood there for a moment, the woman and the child, the woman who had walked this line for 8 years, and the child who had walked it for 1, both of them looking at the wire running north exactly as far as it was supposed to run. Margaret put her hand on the gate post. Not the wire, the post, solid under her palm. "When I'm old," she said, with the matter-of-fact gravity of a 6-year-old making a reasonable projection, "I'm going to check this fence too." Corinne looked at the post under her daughter's hand, the wood worn smooth at the height where hands had rested on it for 7 years of mornings, the iron hardware darkened by weather, the wire running away from it north, taut and level, into the October morning. "I expect you will," she said, and that was the whole of what needed saying. The frost finished lifting. The cottonwood made a small sound in the morning wind. Somewhere on the Thule flat ground to the north, which was Ellis's ground now, and showed it in the way, ground shows the attention of someone who intends to stay. A door opened and closed, the sound of a day beginning, the sound of another person, on adjacent ground, starting the same kind of morning. The fence stood along the north line. It had stood for 7 years, and it would stand for 30 more, and eventually it would need to be rebuilt, and whoever rebuilt it would rebuild it, because the line it marked was still the line, and the line still needed marking, which was the only reason a fence existed, and the only reason that mattered. Corinne opened the gate and they went in.